of time to escape the young to at the edge, as she was right below, of run back to her.
The human condition.
He said, she said. He said what was on his heart, words he'd locked up within himself for so long. He spoke his version of the truth, what he felt was true, but he shouldn't have said anything at all. When he looked at her, his heart exploded with joy and his stomach looped itself in knots. Affection poured out from his lips. She was special. Yet, his words fell short upon her ears. They were old and tiresome. He was fighting a losing battle, trying to save what was already lost. She finally said what she wanted to say, relaying the love given to her by the man standing before her. The more she spoke of love and devotion, the more her heart became elated. But her words too were overused. Her expressions of love were dull. They did not heal her wounds. They couldn't convince him to stay. They could not break through the wall. Where did it go wrong? How did it fall apart? They were the image of perfection, the ideal couple, but it is possible this image was read incorrectly. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, so what does this picture have to say? The ideal couple on the brink of separation. All smiles, but no love. No matter how much they repeated their mantra of affectionate gestures or how many times they said, "I love you," behind the charade they kept up for the world, they knew their words were meant for someone else.
Time to escape the young at the edge, as she was right below, of run back to her.
The human condition. Shadow. There was nothing, an absence of light. A silence so profound, a pinprick would be lost in it. For 4 days it stayed this way, or at least it felt like that. It seemed to go on forever. Every step he took was slow and wavering, as if he was traversing the edge of a cliff, but he was already in the abyss, a space of infinite nothingness. There were some days when he felt like he couldn't breathe. He wasn't sure if it was true or if it was just his imagination turning on him. When he didn't attempt to move forward, he lay down and let the silence take over. He remained alive, and he knew he would continue to live, somehow. That was the only certainty this place gave him. Suddenly, it all changed. He felt a new sensation on his skin. It was like the rays of daybreak. It didn't burn or sting. He opened his eyes to see a dull light shining on him. He raised his hands to meet it. It danced on his fingers. He felt something stir within him. He squinted against the light as he hauled himself up and began walking towards it. He could feel the fatigue ravaging his body, but the closer he got to the light, the easier it became to breathe. He stopped shortly before entering the luminous cloud and looked back towards the darkness. He was glad to be out of it, to have made it this far. However, he was apprehensive as he turned back to the light. "This is everything you've been waiting for," he whispered to himself. He tensed as the darkness lingered behind him, but he wouldn't give in. He didn't want to go back. He turned to the light, closed his eyes, and he took a deep breath as he stepped through. The silence that had once encompassed him was now replaced with the sounds of life. He opened his eyes and saw vehicles speeding along in either direction, people talking and the sound of feet on the pavement, children playing and laughing, nature filling in the empty spaces. As he looked around, taking it all in, he couldn't help but laugh. He felt his soul lighten and rise within him. He was finally back to where he belonged. As he made his way down the street, he took notice of every little detail. The vibrant colours and textures jumped at him from every angle. He noticed a man walking in front of him, looking as eagerly as he did. But his manner bore no sense of awe. He shrugged and continued on, but the man did not leave him. Wherever he went, the man was there. No matter what he did, the man followed. He had tried to get the man's attention, but it seemed impossible. He could feel the frustration rising, and his spirits begin to slump. All around town, in and out of the buildings, he dashed around until evening set in. Before long, he was in the room he remembered, preparing to sleep, when he noticed he couldn't lay down. He felt nauseous. It was like he was floating above it. He reached out to grab the bedside table, but instead saw his hand go right through it. He stared in disbelief. "This can't be happening," he thought. "I've been here before. He must be toying with me." The other man was in the room. "Who are you?" he demanded, but the man never replied. He walked around the bed and looked at the man. "Tell me who you are," he growled. "What are you playing at?" The man made no reply. The man's defiance plagued his nerves. He felt a desperation creep over him. What threat did this stranger pose? Why was he silent? "Tell me who you are," he yelled, as the light hit him from the window. The soft golden glow engulfed him. He rose his hands to shield his eyes, but the light pierced straight through him. He looked around for something to cover his eyes, but his hands could not get a grip. They passed through every object he reached for. He backed up against the wall, trying to lean on it, but found he couldn't. He slipped through it. He pulled himself back into the room and hovered in front of the wall. He stood there, trying to make sense of it. He thought about the man, now laying in his bed, and how he had followed him. There was something familiar about this man. He felt a strange connection, like they were part of one another. It was then that he realized what he was. Every movement he made, every gesture he performed, the man had done everything exactly. A mirror image. Except the man wasn't the mirror. He was. It was he that had been mimicking the movement of the man in front of him. He was the copy, not the man. He didn't belong in the room. He belonged in the darkness from where he had come. The realization of what he was saddened him as the light went out and he felt his body fade. He was nothing but a shade of the man on the bed. A copy. A fake. A mirror reflection with no merit to his name. A shadow.
Sometimes escaped the young woman's phone at the end, as she was right below of run back to her.
The human condition.
The exit. It was dimly lit where he sat. The sound of wheels grinding the tracks pierced his eardrums as they screeched and squealed below. He looked out the window as the city began to light up. Streetlights flickered on, and the windows of buildings became illuminated. He'd always thought the city was most beautiful at night. Its golden glow reminded him of fireflies in the field. It was only this way at night. No one else thought of it this way. He was the only romantic he knew. He saw the potential, saw the stories that could be told, the poems to be recited and the songs to be sung about the city and the night and the people who roamed within it. He saw people in dishevelled suits driving home with the sour looks. He saw couples holding hands and friends strolling together cackling and waving their arms. He lifted his wrists to check the time. The face of the watch flashed 8:30. He sighed and he rested his head on the interior of the train. He sat like that for a while, glancing sleepily around the metal capsule. No one Absolutely no one. He was there all alone. It was comforting in a way. Every other day he'd be surrounded by hordes of people crammed together like cattle in a barn. Tonight, he was glad that he was alone. He almost felt like he needed it.
Times escaped the young woman at the edge as she was right below of one back to her.
The human condition.
Save yourself. The young man rubbed his eyes in disbelief, making sure he'd seen it right. The words flickered in front of him. He gazed at them for a moment more until he blinked and saw the name of the train stop. He was sure that if there had been others with him, they would have felt the same. They disappeared from his view. 2 strange words, but they'd already been ingrained in his mind. Words of warning. It could have been a coincidence. Been alone on the train. Was it a supernatural occurrence? Somebody or something trying to guide him? Only God knew that he dreaded going home. Maybe this was his way of giving him an exit.
Times escaped the young woman at the edge as she was right below of one back to her.
The human condition.
Destiny's Edge.
5,
4,
3, 2, 1.
The sequence was repeated over and over again. In an instant, he drew near the edge. The scenery below terrified him, while the one above had captivated him. This was his moment. Everything seemed right. He should have been able to do this, but some invisible force was stopping him, holding him back.
Pre-show jitters, huh?
A voice from behind him whispered. He turned to see the most beautiful creature standing there, the girl whose simple elegance struck him so intensely that he forgot how to breathe.
I'm almost there, okay? I've got this.
He replied with a smirk. She frowned at him. She could feel his hesitation. She waited to see what he would do next.
Don't give me that.
She scoffed.
I know you're faking it. You're terrified.
She knew he was stalling, and she wasn't going to have it. He looked over at the edge, at the ground below, and back to her.
I'll admit, I've tried doing it, making myself jump, but
He trailed off, before admitting.
I'm scared I might not be good enough.
She took his hand and held it tenderly.
We've been gearing up to do this for months.
She said.
And both of us know you can do this. I know you can do this.
He almost didn't trust her words, but he knew she was right.
Why do I already feel like a failure?
He was being honest. That was certain to her. She tried to find words of reassurance that wouldn't sound like a cliché. She looked at the sky and to the ground below. Even she felt intimidated, but she knew that it had to be done. She saw him tremble. She moved closer to him and stood in front of him. With hardly any inches between them, she wrapped her fingers around his.
Don't you dare think about backing out now.
She whispered.
I know you can do this, and you do too.
Again, his mind tried to disprove her words.
Do you really think so?
I do.
She said.
And you know I'm right.
She was right. Everything they had been through had led up to this moment. If he turned back now, he'd regret not taking that step. She kept her gaze on him. She believed in him. She believed in what they were doing. This wasn't just some exercise in ability or strength. It was destiny calling their name.
So are you going to do it?
She asked. He watched her slowly inching towards the edge. He wanted to reach out to her and pull her back, but he knew better.
I guess it's now or never, right?
Carpe diem.
She smiled.
Trust your heart and trust me. Put your mind at rest and let your heart guide you.
Okay.
He steadied his breathing. preparing himself. She looked ahead at what was before them, before turning back to call out to him.
Are you coming?
Of course.
He said as he walked towards her.
Good.
She smirked.
I'll catch you when I'm down there.
For a moment, he didn't know what to think as she stepped forward and let herself fall.
Whatever you do, trust your heart. Trust her.
He chanted to himself. He felt a burst of energy surge within him as he ran to the edge and leapt. He fell freely and felt the cool air rush around him before it went black, and his hand met hers.
Time to escape the young woman's fire at the edge, as she was right below of our back to her.
The human condition. It always burns deepest. There were many reasons for him to be awake in the middle of the night. His thoughts were rapid. They jumped between the past, present, and future. But one thing stuck, one painful thought. If he didn't say anything, everyone would assume he was fine. He wasn't fine. He was being torn apart inside. There was no escaping it. He tried to shut it out, but there was no way to end it. They mocked him. His thoughts betrayed him. For the second time, he felt the agony of betrayal.
Time to escape the young woman's fire at the edge, as she was right below of our back to her.
The human condition.
Lost but not forgotten. 1 second, an instant, a single moment in the timeline. He didn't want to believe what he had witnessed. 1 minute they were there, the next they were gone. His parents vanished. He tried to reconcile with himself. Perhaps he had just imagined it. His vivid imagination had led him astray before. He couldn't tell. The only sensation he felt, in that moment, was paralyzing fear. Fear that made you feel like your feet were screwed down to the floor, and your body was suspended in a thick vat of mud, so that only your head stuck out to see the fate before you. He panicked and began to whirl around in circles, trying to see the faces of the people around him. The crowd moved like ants. There were lines of people who knew where they were going, heads up high, and eyes straight ahead. He dashed around, his small feet trying to steady his little body. He could feel the tears coming. They blurred his vision, causing him to wipe them vigorously as he continued searching. He called out for his parents, but his tiny voice was drowned out by the bustle of the crowd around him. He thought he was to blame. His tears fell heavier as he sat on the ground, refusing to go any further. He was only a child. How could they do this to him? His confusion slowly consumed him. The rain started to set in. As the sky joined in on his sorrow, he thought he heard a familiar sound. A faint voice called out to him.
Jeremiah! Jeremiah!
It drew closer, and he was sure he recognized it. He wiped his eyes and listened intently until the voice called for him again. The boy hauled himself off the ground and stood in a puddle of rain and tears. His eyes darted around wildly, seeking the voice that beckoned him.
Jeremiah!
The voice called again. He knew who it was then. It was his mother.
Mom!
He cried.
Jeremiah, where are you?
I'm coming!
He shouted. He swiveled around and pushed through the crowd, following the voice. By now, the streets were full of people, but that wasn't going to stop him. He had to get to her. He pushed himself further. He ran, balancing himself as he did. His little legs couldn't take it.
I'm coming, Mom!
The boy called out as he ran. He Yet he still couldn't see the horizon through the sea of people. He stopped for a second and called out for his mother, but there was no reply. Panic rose within him, and heat flushed his body. He felt the anxiety grip him once more.
Mummy!
The boy cried with anguish. It was then he felt something touch his shoulder.
Mum, is that you?
He whispered.
It's okay, darling.
A woman's voice said tenderly.
I'm here.
Without hesitation, he let himself relax into the arms of his mother. He no longer felt fear, only the warmth of his mother's embrace.
I'm here for you, sweetheart.
She said softly.
And I'll never leave you.
Attempts to escape the young woman's further to the edge as she was right below of run back to her.
The human condition.
The place she roams. The rain drummed steadily against the window. Her eyes didn't twitch as her focus shifted seamlessly from the drops on the glass to the world outside. Today wasn't the best. She was sent home from work, told to take it easy for a while, with no pay. The rain started when she left, making her soaked to the bone. She lugged about her drenched coat as she walked to her car. She got home and tried to tear it off, but it stuck to her like a second skin. As she struggled with it, she felt the last of her patience wear out. Her dog bounded up to her and pawed at her legs. She tried to shake her off, but the little dog thought it was a game. She pleaded with her puppy to leave her alone, as the soggy coat fell to the ground and she slumped on her couch. The pup let out a sad yelp and scurried away before she could apologize. Another sigh of annoyance escaped the young woman's lips as she tread heavily to her bathroom. She stood against the shower wall and closed her eyes. She let herself become absorbed in the simple serenity of the place. After this, she returned to the couch and began staring blankly out the window. There was still one thing plaguing her mind. She could feel it gnawing on her heart. She tried to distract herself by reading, then cuddling with her puppy, but it was still there. She put the book down on the coffee table with a thump and covered her face with her hands. She breathed quickly, trying to get the air in, trying to stay calm. She knew her puppy could sense her distress. She stroked her soft yellowish fur to reassure her. She stared out the window again. The clouds continued to cry. She watched their tears race down the glass, not noticing her own tears streaming down her face. She didn't want to cry, but crying felt good. She let it build up in her chest before it all rushed out. She felt like she would throw up if she didn't get it out. She could hear her puppy whimper on her lap. The small dog jumped up and tried to lick her face. Her little wet nose nuzzled at the woman's hands, trying to get to her face. The young woman pushed her away and held her on her lap. It all came flowing out. The tears, the anguish, the distress, the pain she had suppressed for a lifetime. She lost track of how long she was there. It was dark outside when she came to her senses. She had cried until her body wouldn't let her, until it had dried out. It felt good to lose it, to let it pour out. After all, her tears were for him. They always were. She was determined to hold on to him in her memories, even though the pain was excruciating. Even though he was gone, she wasn't going to forget him. She kept him alive in her mind. She thought they would have more time. She thought they would build a life together. He was her everything. He was her morning and evening, her moon and stars. He was the best of his kind, the best man who ever lived, her lover and best friend. He was her husband. He was no more.
time to escape the young woman's at the edge as she was right below of abandoned her.
The human condition.
End of phase. One day it'll happen to you. It'll come when you least expect it. Don't worry, there's someone out there for you.
How many times had he heard those words? Too many times to count. He'd always believed he'd find a fairy tale love, but there was always a doubt that crept in and stopped him from dreaming. When he thought about the future, it was always bleak. Did he lose his ability to dream? Possibly. Did he care? He didn't know. He observed the crowd around. He could pick out with pinpoint accuracy those who were happy and those who were miserably single, like him. The sting he felt when he saw others like himself was indescribable. He wished he could tell them it was going to be all right, but he couldn't. He never tried to gain pity from others. He put on his best face whenever happy couples were around, but that didn't mean it hurt less. Why did he feel guilty about being here? Was it because he secretly hated it all and was about to burst from holding his frustration in? Perhaps. But this was jealousy sneaking in. It was trying to tear him away from the ones he loved. He really was happy for his friends. They'd found each other, and now they were celebrating their wedding with everyone they loved, including himself. Yet, he still couldn't bring himself to be 100% happy. Part of him still burned with envy as he struggled to keep his composure. His heart had been wounded badly once before, and still hadn't recovered from it. Now it was ruining his night and giving him a sour expression that concerned the people sitting with him. He needed more time. He needed to leave. In that moment, there was a decision to be made. He could either stay, allowing the jealousy to fester inside of him, or he could go. A series of questions entered his head. Was it the right thing to do? Would anyone notice if he left the celebrations early? What would he tell John? He looked over to his friends. The happy couple were laughing and joking with their guests. He smiled at them. They wouldn't be the same now. There was a large chasm between them that only one had crossed. John had crossed it. John left him alone. In the end, he decided to leave. He looked around the room once before, settling his eyes on the bride and groom. He saluted them and said his goodbyes. Taking a breath, he straightened his suit jacket, placed the glass on a nearby table, and walked out of the venue. It hurt to leave now, but he had to do so. He knew they were better off without him. They were different people now, no longer close to each other. As he exited the venue, a wave of emotion swept over him. This was it. He took one final step and felt the tether break between his friends and himself. He wasn't quite sure how life would progress from this point. It was time to reinvent himself so that he could get through the next phase.
Time to escape the young woman's at the edge as she was right below of abandoned her.
The human condition.
In her mind. It was difficult to hear what she did. She didn't want it, but it was given to her. Some days she hated it, the cacophony of voices that berated her ears like constant gunfire. Other times she embraced it, welcomed it. The words of the people around her swirled violently inside her head, a ferocious whirlpool of chatter. There was only one voice she cared about amidst the chaos, but she didn't hear it. If she could only get through to him, then maybe she'd have the chance to tell him how she really felt.
Attempts to escape the young woman at the edge as she was right below of one back to her.
The human condition.
Roar. Everything within him burned with ferocious anger, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Normally, he wouldn't allow himself to become like this, but this time, he needed it to happen. All the negative emotions began to bubble within him, threatening to rise to the surface and explode. He knew it probably wasn't a good idea to react like this, but it was necessary. It was the only way to get over the heartbreak. He was looking for a renewal. He wanted to get away from his past. Isolating himself seemed like the best plan. He breathed heavily, trying to control it. His body burned, as sweat dropped from his brow. The air became hot, and his will was failing. He knelt on the ground and tilted his head back. All came out then. He screamed. The sound that erupted from him was inhuman. The more he screamed, the hotter his body burned. With each breath, it felt like he was fanning the flames. Every muscle tensed and pulsated with pain, but he was willing to go through with it. When he released his final, agonizing howl, he collapsed to the floor, body shaking and dripping with sweat. He laid there for a while, catching his breath, when suddenly, he felt the presence of someone else enter the room. It was someone he knew. He felt strong, calm hands lift him from the floor as he was led away to the nearby couch. His body ached as it sank into the soft cushions.
Do you feel better now?
The voice asked. The young man slowly opened his eyes. He saw a figure that he assumed was a man. The figure waited for a moment until he knew the young man could see him. He smiled.
So, is it all gone?
His father asked. The young man took a deep breath and closed his eyes. As he exhaled, he replied,
I think so.
That's good.
His father said.
I knew you could do it.
Thanks, Dad.
He replied, smiling. It felt cool now. He closed his eyes once more and drifted off.
Attempts to escape the young woman at the edge as she was right below of one back to her.
The human condition.
Pack Mentality Part 1. He could just walk away and it would all be over. It was the easiest thing to do. But when he looked at her, guilt crept into his mind. He couldn't leave her alone. Jane held onto Ezra's hands tightly. She didn't care how bad the situation was. She wouldn't let go. Ezra grew weary of the decision they had to make, as the two of them stood together.
Tell me why,
she asked.
You already know why.
Ezra said.
That's not the answer I want.
Look, everything that's needed to be said has already been spoken.
So you're going to listen to them now?
He scoffed.
No, I'm not. Why would you think that?
I know you, Ezra. And I know you've been with them. How could you do that to me, when you know they're the ones that caused everything?
Ezra snatches his hands away from her and growled deeply. Jane was not put off.
I know you're so much more than what they created you to be, Ezra.
She tried to hold his shoulder, but he pulled away.
It doesn't mean I'm any good for anyone.
He growled.
Especially you.
His words cut deep, but Jane stood her ground. She wasn't giving up so easily.
I don't care what they tried to tell you, Ezra,
she said, moving to stand in front of him.
The fact is, we need you. But more than anyone else, I need you. And I'm not leaving until you come with me.
As she looked at him, Ezra could sense Jane was trembling. He knew she was right. He sensed it again. Everything that came from her was the truth, and he couldn't fight that.
Seriously, do you think they'd treat you any better? Running away from your pack was the best thing you could have done.
Ezra composed himself.
Do you really think that me staying is the best decision for everyone?
He asked finally. Jane took his hands again, feeling the points of his claws that he hadn't retracted.
You know it is. It's the best thing for all of us.
Ezra shifted his gaze to Jane. He hadn't noticed he was smiling at her.
You really want me to stay?
He asked, as he felt his heartbeat quicken.
More than anything,
She replied softly. Ezra felt a calm energy overcome him. His claws retreated and he felt himself again. She cupped his hands around Jane's face before she pulled him into her embrace.
I wouldn't be complete without you.
She mumbled over his shoulder.
We're a pack now. We stick together, and I'll never let you go.
Times to escape the young would silence the edge as she tried below of run back to her.
The human condition. Oh, how he loved her. Streetlights flashed inside of the car as he drove along. The radio hummed in the background. The road was empty. They were the only souls travelling along this stretch of road. This thought relaxed him. None to interfere. He looked over at her. The seat was reclined, and she had made herself comfortable. Her arms were folded over her chest, and his leather jacket was draped over her. She still had her glasses on, though she didn't need them in sleep. The frames suited her perfectly, he noted. They were big and rectangular, but they fit her face. He couldn't see her eyes now, but he knew how they were. Big, round hazel eyes that could see right through anyone. Her nose was cute as a button shape, but it was her lips he favoured most. They were a shade of bright coral and tasted like strawberries. They were perfect. He loved the feeling of them against his. He loved to watch them whenever she laughed. Her voice was just as sweet as her lips. It was smooth and sweet. He could listen to it forever. Her smile could bring him to his knees. It was the most pleasant shape he'd ever seen. Her hair was a dark chocolate that shone golden in the sun. It flowed effortlessly from the top of her head in long waves that reached the dimples in her back. He could spend hours running his fingers through it. To him, there was no one else who could match her. She was the most beautiful woman he'd ever known. He'd look back on this moment fondly, the moment he knew she was the one. As they drove on, he felt happy. Dawn began to break on the horizon. It was just him, the open road ahead, and the woman he loved.